In this video, we're going to talk about float. And float is the wiggle room or the slack a task has in our schedule. Total float is the maximum amount of time an activity can be delayed without delay in the project. Free float is the amount of time an activity can be delayed without impacting the early start date of its immediate successor activity. And then, of course, total float and free float are used as part of the critical path method. An activity can have different amounts of free float and total float. However, free float will always be equal to or less than total float, never greater. And activities on the critical path always have a float of 0. So how do we determine float? Well, first we do a forward pass from left to right to determine the early start and early finish dates of our activities. Then we do a backward pass from right to left to determine the late start and late finish dates of our activities. When presented with a diagram like this, calculating total float is simple. You simply compare the difference between the early and late finishes or the early and late start dates. Either will give you total float. So for activity F, we would compare 10 to 11 or 8 to 9 and see that activity F has a total of 1 unit of float. Calculating free float is also not difficult, but it requires a bit more thought. To calculate free float for an activity, look at the activity that comes next. That's the successor activity. The early start date of the successor activity minus the early finish date of the current activity minus 1 equals free float for the current activity. So to determine free float for activity C, we take 8, the early start date of the successor activity, activity F, and we subtract 5, the early finish date for activity C, then subtract 1. So 8 minus 5 minus 1 is 2. Activity C has 2 days of free float. To determine the free float for activity B, we take 8, the early start date for activity E, and subtract 4, the early finish date for activity B, and then subtract 1. Our free float is 3, which happens to also be our total float for activity B. I hope this video has helped you better understand the concept of float.